For decades, America relied on India's cheap medicines to keep healthcare costs under control. From antibiotics to diabetes treatments, Indian factories supplied nearly half of the generics on U.S. shelves. But that lifeline may now turn into a weapon. After Donald Trump's decision to slap 50% tariffs on Indian goods, New Delhi has answered with a move no one expected, targeting the very pills millions of Americans depend on. Officials in Washington call it dangerous, while in India it is seen as a bold stand against unfair pressure. The stakes go far beyond trade numbers or profit margins. This fight is now about health, survival, and political power. What happens when medicine itself becomes a tool of confrontation? That is the question hanging over both nations, as tariffs collide with a resource more vital than oil or steel, the drugs that keep people alive. Donald Trump's new 50% tariffs on Indian goods landed like a hammer blow. The move was framed in Washington as protecting American workers, but in New Delhi it was seen as a direct assault. Within weeks, Indian exports to the U.S. plunged. Textiles, one of India's oldest industries, saw shipments fall by more than 30%. Pharmaceutical exports dropped sharply, while the IT sector reported contracts frozen or canceled. For companies that had built ties with the U.S. market over decades, the sudden collapse was devastating. The numbers tell the story. India's trade surplus with the U.S., once over $35 billion, is now shrinking at record speed. According to industry groups, nearly half of mid-sized exporters reported major losses in the first month alone. Business leaders warned that if the tariffs hold, hundreds of thousands of jobs in India could be at risk. The anger in New Delhi is rising, and not only among executives. Officials view the tariffs as a betrayal by a partner once described as strategic. But India is not preparing a conventional response. Instead of more tariffs or visa restrictions, New Delhi is reaching for something far more powerful: its pharmaceutical industry, a sector America cannot live without. India's response did not come in the form of tariffs or travel restrictions. Instead, New Delhi reached for its most powerful lever: medicine. More than 40% of generic drugs consumed in the United States are made in India. These aren't luxury products. They are the pills millions of Americans take every day to fight infections, control diabetes, and manage heart disease. In some categories, like broad-spectrum antibiotics and anti-diabetic treatments, India is the single largest supplier. That scale gives New Delhi unique leverage. Building these industries has taken decades of state support, low-cost labor, and the creation of massive pharmaceutical clusters in Hyderabad and Gujarat. Today, Indian factories produce medicine at costs 30 to 40% lower than U.S. facilities. Even the raw materials for many pills, known as active pharmaceutical ingredients, still come mainly from India and China. Washington cannot simply switch suppliers. Officials in New Delhi insist that life-saving drugs such as insulin or cancer treatments will not be blocked. But restrictions on widely used antibiotics, antivirals, and painkillers are already being discussed. Indian leaders frame this not as an attack on the American people, but as a direct warning to the White House. What's at stake are lives, not abstract trade balances. For Washington, the threat is alarming. The Food and Drug Administration has already warned that shortages of key generics could emerge within months if India follows through. That would mean higher drug prices, empty shelves in pharmacies, and rising pressure on U.S. hospitals. The situation has exposed a critical vulnerability. America's health system depends on a supply chain it does not control. And India has shown it is ready to weaponize that dependence in its battle with Trump's tariffs, forcing Washington to confront a dilemma far more dangerous than trade statistics. America's dependence on Indian pharmaceuticals runs much deeper than most realize. Over the past 3 decades, India has built vast pharmaceutical clusters in places like Hyderabad and Gujarat. These are not small factories. They are sprawling industrial zones with thousands of chemists, engineers, and technicians working around the clock. Entire supply chains have been built to manufacture everything from antibiotics to cardiovascular drugs, and the scale is staggering. India now produces more than 20% of the world's generic medicines, making it the second largest supplier globally after China. The reason companies flock to India is simple: cost and efficiency. Production there is on average 30 to 40% cheaper than in the United States. For American pharmaceutical giants such as Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson, outsourcing to India was a way to cut expenses while still meeting global demand. But in doing so, Washington allowed a critical sector of its healthcare system to become dependent on foreign factories. Trying to rebuild that capacity at home would not be easy. Experts estimate it would take at least 5 to 7 years and billions of dollars in investment to develop the infrastructure, train the workforce, and secure raw materials. And even then, the U.S. would struggle with higher labor and regulatory costs. The problem goes beyond finished medicines. Most active pharmaceutical ingredients, the chemical base of modern drugs, also come from India and China. This means that if New Delhi restricts exports, American pharmacies will feel the impact almost immediately. Hospitals already dealing with inflation in medical supplies could face shortages within weeks. The vulnerability is now clear. Washington has no quick replacement for India's pharmaceutical power, leaving the health of millions exposed to geopolitical decisions made thousands of miles away. The news of India preparing to restrict drug exports set off alarms in Washington almost immediately. According to officials, emergency meetings were convened at the White House with the FDA and the Department of Health and Human Services. The discussions focused on how quickly shortages could appear and what stopgap measures might buy time. Options included sourcing medicines through third countries, fast-tracking emergency licenses for alternative suppliers, and accelerating domestic production. Yet even in optimistic scenarios, experts admitted it could take months before any of these steps produced meaningful results. The political fallout has been fierce. Republican lawmakers urged Trump to respond with tougher measures, calling for higher tariffs and even visa restrictions on Indian IT professionals. They argued that showing weakness would only invite more pressure. Democrats, meanwhile, seized on the crisis to attack the administration, warning that the president's tariff war had put ordinary Americans at risk. Behind closed doors, the mood is one of unease. Senior health officials warned that the U.S. has no short-term substitute for India's production capacity. The crisis is exposing a reality few in Washington want to admit. America's healthcare system is far more dependent on foreign supply chains than anyone had been willing to acknowledge. Inside India, the government's decision is being celebrated as a historic stand. Major newspapers carried bold headlines declaring that New Delhi had, for the first time, used medicine as a tool of power. The Times of India called it a turning point in the nation's foreign policy. Across big cities like Mumbai, Delhi, and Hyderabad, rallies were organized in support of Prime Minister Modi's tough response. Demonstrators waved national flags and held signs praising the country's pharmaceutical industry as the pride of India. On social media, the hashtag #PILLSFORPOWER surged to the top of trending lists, with thousands of users applauding the move as overdue. Many Indians argue that their country has been too dependent on American markets for too long, and that Washington has taken India's role for granted. Business leaders, meanwhile, framed the decision as proof that India has the strength to defend its industries and workers. Still, not everyone inside India is optimistic. Some health experts warned that the confrontation could also create instability in supply chains and raise prices domestically. Yet the prevailing mood is one of confidence, with many citizens convinced that the time has come for India to show its strength on the global stage. India's move is not only about Washington, it is sending shockwaves across the global stage. Within BRICS, talks are already underway to form a new medical alliance with India at the center. The idea is simple but powerful. If the American market closes, India can redirect its exports to Africa, Latin America, and even parts of Europe where demand for affordable drugs is rising fast. In 2023 alone, the global generic drug market was valued at more than $450 billion. And BRICS nations see this as an opportunity to build their own health security network outside of Western control. For many developing countries, access to Indian generics has long been the difference between treatment and no treatment. A coordinated BRICS framework could make those supplies cheaper, more predictable, and less vulnerable to U.S. pressure. Analysts are already comparing this to Russia's use of natural gas in Europe. a strategic resource that can shape geopolitics. The difference is that here the commodity is not energy, but medicine. If such an alliance solidifies, it could cement India's image as the pharmacy of the global South. And for Washington, that means the standoff with Trump's tariffs is no longer a bilateral dispute. It is becoming a global realignment. The confrontation has reached a point where the numbers on trade sheets no longer matter. What is at stake now are the lives of ordinary people. In the United States, more than 150 million prescriptions each year are filled with medicines that come from India. These include everyday antibiotics, painkillers, and drugs that control blood pressure and blood sugar. If those supplies slow down, pharmacies could face shortages within weeks. Prices would rise almost immediately, and millions of patients already struggling with high medical costs would be forced to choose between treatment and bills. Hospitals are especially vulnerable. Generic injectables used in surgeries and emergency care are heavily sourced from Indian factories. A disruption could affect everything from routine operations to life-saving procedures in intensive care units. Doctors warn that even short delays in availability could put patients at risk. For Trump, this is no longer about tariffs or campaign slogans. The choice before him is stark: continue the confrontation and risk the health of his citizens, or step back and seek compromise. India has placed its bet on the power of medicine. Whether Washington calls that bluff or bows to reality will decide how deep this crisis cuts into American lives. For the first time, a trade war has crossed into the most personal territory: people's health. Pills that once symbolized care and survival are now bargaining chips in a geopolitical standoff. If medicine can be turned into a weapon, then no resource is truly safe from politics. The world is watching whether Trump will double down on confrontation or step back before pharmacies run dry. Do you see India's move as justified resistance or reckless brinkmanship? Share your thoughts in the comments, and make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the battles reshaping our global order.